The late afternoon sun streamed through the canopy of trees, dappling the winding pathways with soft patches of golden light. Jalen Carter, his sneakers crunching softly against the gravel, walked alone through the park, his hands tucked casually into his hoodie pockets. This place was his sanctuary, a rare slice of calm in an otherwise chaotic world. Laughter echoed faintly from a group of children playing on the swings in the distance, blending with the chirping of birds and the gentle rustle of leaves. Jalen glanced around and smiled to himself. The park felt alive but tranquil, its familiar sights and sounds wrapping him in a sense of safety. Today, like many Sundays, he had come here to surprise his father, Captain Malcolm Carter, who often patrolled this area. It had become their little tradition, one Jalen secretly loved. The look of joy on his dad's face when he spotted him was worth every second of the trek. As Jalen ventured deeper into the park, the noise began to fade, replaced by an eerie stillness. He didn't think much of it at first, assuming he'd just wandered away from the more crowded areas. But something about the quiet unsettled him, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that he couldn't quite place. He picked up his pace, eager to find his father. Turning a corner on the trail, Jalen froze. Ahead stood a police officer, his posture rigid and eyes fixed directly on him. Jalen's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't his dad. It wasn't anyone he recognized. The man's expression was cold, his gaze piercing and unwelcoming. "Hey, you," the officer barked, his voice sharp enough to cut through the stillness. Jalen flinched, instinctively stepping back. "Me?" Jalen asked, his voice cautious. "Yeah, you. What are you doing here?" the officer demanded, stepping closer. His towering frame seemed to block out the sunlight, casting a shadow over the path. Jalen swallowed hard. "I'm just walking. My dad's on duty here, Captain Carter." The mention of his father's name did nothing to soften the officer's demeanor. Instead, his lips curled into a sneer. "Captain Carter's kid, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Guess that makes you think you own this place, don't it?" Jalen blinked, stunned. "No, sir. I'm just here to see him. I'm not doing anything wrong." The officer stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Kids like you," he muttered, shaking his head. "Always think you can just stroll into a nice neighborhood park and act like you belong." Jalen's cheeks burned with humiliation and anger. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble," he said quietly, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Trouble's what you bring, whether you mean it or not," the officer shot back. "Now, why don't you show me some ID? Or are you too young to even carry one?" Jalen's hands trembled as he fumbled for his wallet. I don't have it with me," he stammered. "Of course you don't," the officer said, his tone mocking. "Just like every other punk who thinks they're above the rules." Jalen glanced around, hoping someone might walk by and intervene, but the trail was deserted. His stomach churned as the officer's glare intensified. Suddenly the man's gaze shifted, landing on something in the grass a few feet away. A sinister grin spread across his face. Well, the officer muttered. "Looks like you've got company." Jalen followed his gaze and his breath caught in his throat. A massive python lay coiled in the grass, its scales glinting in the sunlight as it flicked its tongue in and out. He froze, paralyzed by a wave of fear. "Scared of a little snake?" the officer jeered, his tone laced with cruel amusement. "What's the matter? I thought tough kids like you weren't afraid of anything?" "Please," Jalen whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't want to go near it." But the officer wasn't listening. He reached out and shoved Jalen forward, his hand firm and unyielding. Jalen stumbled, nearly losing his balance as he landed just feet away from the python. The snake lifted its head, its dark, unblinking eyes locking onto him. "Go on," the officer said, folding his arms. "Let's see how tough you really are." Jalen's chest tightened as he struggled to breathe. "Help me," he cried, his voice raw with panic. The officer laughed, a cold, heartless sound that echoed through the empty trail. "Help you? Why would I do that? Nobody's coming to save you, kid. You're on your own out here." The python began to move, uncoiling with terrifying speed. Jalen scrambled backward, his hands clawing at the ground, but the snake was faster. It lunged toward him, wrapping its muscular body around his legs and pinning him in place. "Please," Jalen screamed, tears streaming down his face. Somebody help me. The officer stood motionless, his smirk unwavering. Maybe this'll teach you not to think you're so special, he muttered, his voice cold and devoid of empathy. Jalen's strength began to fade as the python's coils tightened around him, crushing the air from his lungs. Desperation overtook him as his vision blurred, the edges darkening with every labored breath. Someone. Help, he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. In his fading consciousness, he prayed for a miracle, for someone, anyone, to come and save him. The air was electric with tension as Captain Malcolm Carter strode into the park, his tall frame cutting a commanding figure against the setting sun. He spotted Jalen first, crumpled on the ground, trembling. Relief and fury warred within him. Then his gaze shifted to Officer Derek Blake, standing nearby with his arms crossed, a smirk plastered across his face. Blake Malcolm's voice was sharp, authoritative, carrying across the quiet clearing. He closed the distance between them in long strides, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Step away from my son. Blake didn't flinch. If anything, his smirk deepened, an infuriating expression of indifference. Captain Carter, Blake drawled, tipping his head mockingly. Didn't expect to see you here. Your boy was just learning a little lesson about respect. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Respect. You call this respect? He gestured to Jalen, who was now sitting up but still pale and shaking. What the hell are you doing? Blake shrugged, his voice laced with venom. Just keeping your people in line, Captain. Someone has to. Can't have them thinking they run the place. The words hit Malcolm like a slap, but he steadied himself. His tone turned icy. That's enough, Blake. You're done here. Step away before I call for backup and have you arrested on the spot. Blake's eyes narrowed, his smirk fading. For a moment Malcolm thought he might back down, but then Blake leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. You don't scare me, Carter. You think waving that badge around makes you untouchable? We both know how this works. People like you don't belong in positions of power. Malcolm's fists clenched, but he kept his composure, stepping forward until he was inches from Blake. You're going to answer for this, he said, his voice like steel. Every word, every action. Your days of hiding behind that badge are over. Blake stared at him for a long moment before stepping back, his sneer returning. We'll see about that, Captain. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was thick with unease. News of the incident had spread like wildfire, and Malcolm felt the weight of every gaze as he walked through the halls. Some officers avoided his eyes, while others whispered in tight groups, their expressions unreadable. Lieutenant Priya Patel met him at his office door, her brow furrowed with concern. Captain, I heard what happened. Are you and Jalen okay? We're managing, Malcolm said, stepping inside and gesturing for her to follow. But this isn't over. Blake needs to be held accountable. Priya nodded, but there was hesitation in her eyes. You know there's already talk, she said, her voice low. Some of the guys are saying I'm only supporting you because of. Well, because of our backgrounds. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Let them talk. This isn't about them. This is about doing what's right. Priya sighed, glancing at the closed door. It's not just them. Alvarez has been digging into Blake's record, and she's getting pushback too. People are saying she's overstepping, trying to make it a race issue. Malcolm leaned against his desk, his expression grim. And what has she found? Priya hesitated, then said, a pattern. Complaints from Black and Latino civilians, most of which were dismissed. It's damning, but it's going to make things difficult. Difficult or not, we push forward, Malcolm said firmly. This isn't just about Blake. It's about the culture in this department. Chief Eleanor Whitman sat at the head of the long conference table, her fingers steepled as she listened to Malcolm's report. Her usually composed expression betrayed a flicker of unease as Malcolm finished speaking. Captain Carter, she began, her voice measured. You've made your position clear, but this is a delicate situation. We can't afford to rush into decisions that could divide the department further. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. With all due respect, Chief, this isn't a time for hesitation. Blake's actions were not only reckless, they were racially motivated. If we don't act decisively, we're sending a message that this behavior is acceptable. Whitman sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I understand your perspective, but we also have to consider the optics. The public, the union, this will ignite a firestorm." "It already has," Malcolm countered. "The community knows what happened. They're watching us, waiting to see if we'll do the right thing. Inaction isn't an option." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Whitman nodded, though her expression remained tense. "I'll authorize an internal review. But tread carefully, Captain. This department is on thin ice, and one wrong move could shatter it." As Malcolm left the room, he couldn't shake the frustration simmering in his chest. The battle for justice had only just begun, and the resistance within the department was as fierce as the public outcry outside its walls. But he wasn't about to back down, not for Blake, not for Whitman, and certainly not for the system that allowed men like Blake to thrive. The dimly lit community center buzzed with tension as residents packed into the hall, their voices a mixture of anger and anguish. Folding chairs formed neat rows, but people stood in the aisles, craning their necks to see the makeshift stage where local leaders prepared to speak. A tall man with graying hair stepped to the microphone, his face etched with determination. "We are here because one of our own, Jalen Carter, a child, was treated as less than human," said Pastor Samuel Davis, his voice carrying a weight that stilled the murmurs in the crowd. Officer Blake's actions weren't just about one boy. They represent a systemic failure, a failure that continues to devalue Black lives. The crowd erupted in agreement, hands clapping and voices rising in unison. Jalen sat off to the side, his father Malcolm's steady hand on his shoulder. Malcolm whispered, "You don't have to do this if you're not ready." Jalen shook his head. "I have to, Dad." The room fell silent as Jalen approached the microphone. His small stature made him seem even younger under the harsh fluorescent lights, but his voice, though trembling, commanded attention. "When that officer looked at me," Jalen began, his voice cracking, "I didn't feel like a kid anymore. I felt like I didn't matter. Like my life wasn't worth saving." A ripple of emotion coursed through the audience. Tears brimmed in his eyes, and he took a deep breath, willing himself to continue. He didn't see me. He saw something, someone he thought wasn't worth protecting. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes. Others nodded, murmuring, "That's right, and enough is enough." "I thought I was going to die," Jalen said, his voice stronger now, "and all I could think about was whether my dad would even get the chance to say goodbye to me." A wave of grief and resolve swept the room, punctuated by the sobs of those who could no longer hold back. Malcolm rose from his seat and placed his hand on his son's shoulder as the audience stood, their applause deafening. "We fight for justice," someone yelled, and the chant spread through the room. Justice for Jalen. Justice for us all. The precinct's conference room was stifling, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Malcolm stood at the head of the table, addressing a room full of officers, many of whom refused to meet his gaze. Behind him, a projector displayed slides outlining proposed reforms, mandatory sensitivity training, community oversight, and stricter protocols for officer misconduct. "This isn't about one bad apple," Malcolm said, his tone measured but firm. "It's about changing the culture of this department to ensure that what happened to my son, what happens to so many Black and brown people, never happens again." A snort came from the back of the room. Officer Stevens leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "With all due respect, Captain, Blake was doing his job. Kids like your son need to learn that actions have consequences." The room fell silent as Malcolm's eyes locked onto Stevens. "My son's action was walking in a park," Malcolm said coldly, "and the only consequence he faced was being dehumanized by a man who abused his badge." Another officer, clearly uneasy, spoke up. "Captain, we're just saying this feels like overreach. Changing how we operate could tie our hands." Malcolm stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "What ties our hands is the mistrust we've built in the community. What ties our hands is ignoring the systemic issues that put us in this position to begin with." After the meeting, Malcolm walked to his office, his jaw clenched. As he opened the door, he found an unsigned note on his desk. In block letters, it read, "Watch your back." Malcolm crumpled the paper, his resolve hardening. "If they think this will scare me," he muttered to himself, "they don't know me at all." The press conference was held in front of City Hall, the steps crowded with reporters and cameras. Jalen stood at the podium, his father and community leaders flanking him. The bright midday sun glared down, but Jalen's hands were cold and clammy as he gripped the edges of the podium. "Take your time," Malcolm whispered. Jalen nodded, then leaned toward the microphone. "I didn't want to be here," he began, his voice shaking. "I didn't want to talk about what happened to me, but if I don't, then nothing will change." The cameras clicked, their lenses trained on the boy who seemed so small yet so resolute. "I thought I was just going to the park to see my dad. Instead, I was treated like I didn't belong there, like I didn't have the right to exist." Jalen paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "I didn't know if I'd live to see my dad again." His voice broke, and tears streamed down his face. Malcolm stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder, but Jalen continued. "No one should feel that way. No one should have to wonder if their life matters." The crowd, made up of journalists and onlookers, fell silent. The weight of Jalen's words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Later that evening, clips of Jalen's speech flooded social media. People shared his words with hashtags like Justice for Jalen and End Racial Violence. The video amassed millions of views, and Jalen's courage became a rallying cry for justice and reform. At home, Malcolm hugged Jalen tightly. "You did something incredible today," he said. Jalen leaned into his father's embrace. "I just want people to see what's really happening, Dad." "They see it now," Malcolm said, pride and sadness mingling in his voice. "And they're finally listening." The courtroom buzzed with tension, its benches filled with reporters, community members and supporters of both sides. Jalen sat beside his father, Captain Malcolm Carter, gripping his hand tightly. Malcolm gave him a reassuring nod, though his jaw was clenched. This trial was more than just justice for Jalen, it was a battle against a deep-seated culture of impunity. Blake's defense attorney rose, projecting an air of confidence as he approached the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, pacing deliberately. "Officer Derek Blake acted in a stressful situation, and any reasonable person could have misinterpreted young Jalen Carter's behavior. Let's not forget that this child was wandering alone in a secluded area. Could it not appear suspicious?" The attorney turned sharply toward Jalen, his tone pointed. A disruptive youth unchecked by authority might have been perceived as a threat. Murmurs rippled through the gallery, a mix of anger and disbelief. Malcolm's fist tightened, but Jalen's wide eyes kept him anchored. He squeezed his son's hand, silently telling him to hold on. Detective Maria Alvarez was called to the stand. She stepped forward with quiet authority, her badge glinting under the courtroom lights. "Detective Alvarez," the prosecutor began, "can you speak to Officer Blake's prior conduct?" Alvarez nodded firmly. "During my investigation, I uncovered multiple complaints against Officer Blake for racially biased behavior. One instance involved detaining an unarmed black teen without cause, and in another he used excessive force against a Latino man. None of these complaints were pursued." The defense objected, but the judge overruled. Alvarez's voice gained strength. "These aren't isolated incidents. Officer Blake demonstrated a pattern of targeting minorities, and his actions against Jalen Carter were consistent with this behavior." The jury's expressions hardened, and Blake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Alvarez locked eyes with him briefly, her silent message clear: "You can't hide anymore." When the prosecution rested its case, the atmosphere in the room was electric. As the judge adjourned for the day, Jalen whispered to his father, "Did I do okay, Dad?" "You were brave," Malcolm replied, pulling him into a brief but heartfelt embrace. "And the truth is on our side." Back at the precinct, the air was thick with unease. Malcolm stood at the front of a packed briefing room, flanked by Lieutenant Priya Patel and Detective Maria Alvarez. A projector displayed slides outlining new policies, mandatory sensitivity training, the establishment of an independent oversight board, and stricter penalties for misconduct. Malcolm's voice was steady but firm. "These reforms are not optional. They are necessary to rebuild trust with the community and ensure that everyone is treated with dignity and respect." A murmur of dissent rose from the back of the room. "This is a witch hunt," shouted Officer Wilson, a senior officer and vocal opponent of the changes. "You're tearing apart the department just to appease the public." Malcolm's gaze was unyielding. This isn't about tearing anything apart, it's about accountability. We've failed to address systemic issues for far too long, and it ends now. Priya stepped forward. This isn't just about public perception, it's about doing our jobs right. If we can't ensure fairness within our ranks, how can we serve the community? Wilson scoffed, but his retort was drowned out by murmurs of agreement from other officers. Maria Alvarez added, "Change is hard, but protecting the badge means holding ourselves to a higher standard." The meeting ended in tension, with officers divided. As Malcolm left the room, Priya caught up to him. "We'll face resistance, but some are starting to come around," she said quietly. Malcolm nodded. "We just have to keep pushing." Late one evening, Malcolm walked to his car in the precinct's parking lot, the air cool and still. He heard heavy footsteps behind him and turned to see Derek Blake emerging from the shadows. Blake's face was twisted with anger. "You think you're a hero, Carter? Selling out the Brotherhood for what? A few pats on the back from the media." Malcolm didn't flinch. "This has nothing to do with the media, Blake. It's about doing what's right." Blake stepped closer, his voice low and venomous. "You don't belong in this job. You're tearing us apart. Brotherhood means loyalty, Carter, and you've betrayed it." Malcolm squared his shoulders, his voice calm but resolute. "Brotherhood doesn't mean covering for injustice. It doesn't mean standing by while people like you tarnish the badge we all wear." Blake's sneer faltered, but his anger remained. "You'll regret this. You're painting a target on your back." Malcolm leaned in slightly, his voice a quiet storm. "No, Blake. You painted that target on yourself when you chose hatred over honor. Your time of hiding behind the badge is over." The sound of footsteps interrupted them as Priya Patel and Maria Alvarez approached. "Everything okay here?" Captain Priya asked, her tone sharp. Blake shot a glare at them before storming off. Malcolm exhaled slowly, his gaze following Blake's retreating figure. "It's not over," Priya said softly. "No," Malcolm replied, his voice steady. "But it's a start." The dimly lit hall of the community center buzzed with tension and determination. Rows of folding chairs were filled with residents from every walk of life: Black, Latino, Asian American, and even a few white allies who had come to stand in solidarity. At the front, a makeshift stage bore a banner: "Justice for Jalen, Justice for All." Jalen sat at the center of the youth panel, his small frame almost swallowed by the large wooden chair. Beside him were other young voices from the community, children and teenagers who had faced their own experiences with racial profiling. Miss Simone Green stood at the side, a silent but strong pillar of support. Taking a deep breath, Jalen gripped the microphone, his palms clammy. He glanced at his father, Malcolm, standing at the back of the room, his arms crossed in a gesture of unwavering support. "Good evening," Jalen began, his voice shaky but growing stronger. "I'm Jalen Carter, and a few weeks ago I thought I might not live to see my dad again. But I'm here because I want to tell you that what happened to me doesn't just happen to me. It happens to kids like me every day, and it has to stop." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling like a heavy fog. Jalen shared his story, from the fear of the python's tightening coils to the humiliation of Officer Blake's taunts. His voice cracked as he described the moment he thought no one would come to save him. A young Latina girl on the panel leaned into her microphone. "I was stopped just last month while walking home. They said I looked suspicious. I'm 12. What about me looks suspicious?" The crowd murmured in agreement, a tide of shared pain and anger rippling through the room. One by one, the young panelists shared their stories, each testimony a brick in the wall of collective resilience. When Jalen spoke again, his voice carried a resolve far beyond his years. "We're not asking for much," he said, "just to be treated like we matter, to be safe in our own neighborhoods." The audience erupted into applause. Gabriela Torres, a prominent community leader, stood. "Jalen's courage is our call to action. Starting tomorrow, we rally, we petition, we make it impossible for them to ignore us." Weeks later, the courthouse steps were packed with reporters and community members. News of Officer Blake's conviction spread like wildfire, guilty on all charges. Inside the precinct, Chief Whitman announced new measures: independent oversight, mandatory sensitivity training, and a zero-tolerance policy for misconduct. That evening, Malcolm and Jalen entered the town hall to a thunderous standing ovation. The room was alive with gratitude and admiration, the air electric with hope. Jalen, shy but proud, clutched his father's hand. "Dad, this is amazing." Malcolm leaned down, his voice soft but firm. "You earned this, Jalen. You turned pain into power." As they reached the podium, Malcolm addressed the crowd, his deep voice resonating with conviction. "Today isn't the end of our fight. It's the beginning. Justice isn't a moment, it's a movement." Jalen stepped forward, his voice clear and strong. "If we stand together, we can make sure no one else feels powerless like I did. Change starts with us." The ovation that followed was deafening, filled with hope, resolve, and a determination to create a better future. Father and son stood together, symbols of resilience, ready to face the road ahead.